short. Tall. Flat bones would be like the sternum, kind of obviously flat. Irregular vertebrae. Irregular, I mean vertebrae, how are you going to classify that? It's a pretty irregular looking bone. Couldn't really say it's a long bone. Couldn't really say it's a short bone. So it's an irregular bone. And then sesamoid bone. Anyone want to hazard a guess? What is a sesamoid bone? So like the patella is a sesamoid bone. A lot of times people that work with their hands get them in their fingers. People can get them on the bottoms of their feet. And what that is, it's a bone, so the tendon, so our patella, we have the quadriceps tendon, big, huge tendon, and it comes down here and attaches underneath where our knee is. And that tendon is so heavy and so thick that it begins to ossify, it begins to calcify in the middle of the tendon, and it forms this bone. Now, everybody has a patella, so everybody has this sesamoid bone. Now, other specialized sesamoid bones that people might get in their hands or their feet, not everyone develops that, but what it is this, it's where the tendon has calcified in the middle of the tendon and formed an extra bone. And everybody has one in their knee, and I suppose it's, think of all the things we do from birth, to now with our knees. That's why we have one. It's kind of interesting. And then here's a picture of a Wormian bone. Now, do you guys remember the Wormian bones from last week's lab? So what suture is that located in? It's kind of upside down, by the way. Lambdoidal. Yeah, so the Wormian bones form in the lambdoidal suture, and they're just these little islands that are formed inside the suture. And sometimes they get very large, and then we call them an Ika bone. They have a different name. But it's good review. So we have the diaphysis, the epiphysis, and the metaphysis. So let's talk about those three first. So the diaphysis is this center, the long center portion of the bone. We would look at this from the outside. Okay, it would still be the diaphysis, but most of the time, if you're asked a question on the outside, the longest portion of the bone is the diaphysis. The epiphysis is this growth plate, and there should be one proximal and distal in any of these long bones like this. And then the metaphysis is the plate, is the space in between, kind of right where the two of them meet together. So we have the epiphysis, the metaphysis, and the diaphysis. And don't try to say that 3 times fast, because I don't think I could. But okay, so then we also have this articular cartilage that we find on the articular surface of any of these bones. And we talked about it last week. What kind of cartilage is it? Begins with H. Hyaline, yes, hyaline cartilage, the glassy one. Hyaline means glass, it's kind of glassy one. So that is going to be on the articular surfaces, this articular cartilage. That's how you could tell that's where the articulation was, because you can see the bone changed its density at that spot where the cartilage is. So we have this cartilage over all the articular surfaces. Now we have another coating that is around the outside of the bone. Did I say how long? Okay. So we have this other tissue that is connective tissue that is surrounding the outside of the bone. What would that be called? Periosteum. Right. So we have this, and I have a model of some bone cells here, and this would be this outer surface that is on the covering of all bones, except it is not where the articular cartilage is. But this periosteum is a very, very important tissue. This helps our bones grow in width. So we have blood supply coming here through the periosteum, The periosteum is anchored into the bone by way of little tiny fibers called Sharpie's fibers. And sometimes we can actually see those. When we get into working on the cadavers, we'll peel a little piece of the periosteum off the bone, and you can see those Sharpie's fibers. So what is interesting to me about the periosteum is that, okay, so our muscles have a tendon, and the tendon weaves itself into the periosteum, and the periosteum is woven into the bone. So this is how the tendons attach to the bone, is via the periosteum. So it's a very important structure when you think about it like that. And then if we have a periosteum, then we also have an endosteum. So the endosteum is this, this one is microscopic. This one we can, peel it off. It's actually, I think it's a dense, irregular connective tissue. But we can peel it off. This one is microscopic. We would not be able to peel that off. But if you think about the inside of the bone is coated with this endosteum. It's another layer of connective tissue that covers all of the surfaces of the inside of the bone. And then the medullary cavity is the cavity that, if I were to take the long bone and cut it, then there would be a cavity in there, and that's called the medullary cavity. It is full of red and yellow bone marrow. The yellow bone marrow is predominantly fat, and the red bone marrow is part of the erythropoiesis, or the formation of red blood cells. And this is another picture. You can see a little bit better. So the other thing to notice about, and here you can see the periosteum kind of peeled back off of the surface of the bone. Now the other thing that is kind of interesting about the bone is that we have compact bone on the outsides, and then what we call spongy bone, or trabecula, sometimes called cancellous bone, but that's on the inside of the bone. And so this actually gives our bones a lot more strength, because the bone material itself could get very brittle, but having that spongy layer in there, you guys know that a cylinder is stronger than a flat plane. So if you have a half cylinder, it can bear a lot more weight than like a plate would. So having this spongy bone on the inside actually gives our bones more strength, and it makes them more lightweight, and it's also, as we store things in our bones too. We store calcium, we store fat. So our bones are very, very, very useful for us. So we have this spongy bone on the inside, and it forms these structures called trabeculae, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And you can see here this, the epiphysis would be the top, and then you can see there would be the metaphysis is where the bones, here you can see it better, where this is still sometimes this is commonly referred to as the growth plate. But you can see here then this is the epiphyseal line, which you can almost always see no matter how old the skeleton is. You'd probably still see a line on the spongy bone where that epiphyseal plate was. You can almost always see a remnant of it. And to me, what is fascinating about the trabeculae is that they form along pressure lines. So, for instance, in the hip, we have a lot of these struts that come down. There's a particular pattern that you almost always see of the trabeculae in the hips, and in the femur, in the leg bones, and also in the humerus. So it's like those. So these trabeculae, our body's always responding to pressure and use. And it's just kind of interesting. Like, you might wonder, how do scientists determine that an extinct hominid walked upright? Well, because they've been looking at the trabeculae. And the trabeculae kind of forms like a strut of a bridge. And so they can look at that and they can see weight bearing. Now, here's an experiment that I've kind of always thought would be fun to do, and I think someone was doing it last year in Kentucky. But and maybe this isn't such a problem here, but obesity in children, in the formation when their bones are still being formed and there is this obesity, this is going to change the lay of the trabeculae. It actually changes the way the bones articulate, especially at the knee. And there was this woman I met last year at one of the meetings, and she was doing some studies on that, about how then even later, if that child loses weight, they're going to have permanently affected knees. So, you know, these kinds of things, maybe we don't always think about how that's going to affect us, but it really does in profound ways. So, you know, young children should not be having knee problems, but an excess weight is going to cause the bone to develop differently. And so, nutrient foramina. Yeah, I want to talk about this. This is kind of interesting. So we have developing, so imagine the fetus curled up like this, developing. And so there is a blood supply that is feeding the bone, and it comes in through this little nutrient, what we call a nutrient foramen. So when you're looking at the bones in labs, try to see if you can find that nutrient foramen. Now, babies are like this, so it's going to be kind of in a, it's going to be entering the bone kind of distally at this angle, a little bit different in the legs and in the tibia. So it's kind of interesting. You can see how, you know, babies, when they're forming, how these nutrient arteries first go into the bone, because this nutrients, I mean, bones have a lot of blood in them, and that's something to remember too, is that they're very rich, very lively, rich tissue. And you can see here the compact bone versus the trabecula, or the spongy bone. And let's see, anything else? And you can see here some of these Sharpie fibers as well. Okay. Any questions so far on just this gross anatomy of a long bone? Okay. All right, so now talking about bone markings, again, you know, you're thinking, why didn't I get this last week or 2 weeks ago? But anyway, what we're getting at now, and probably means more to you now because you've been kind of struggling through some of this in the lab. Like, you know, what is a fissure? What fissure did we have last week?
Orbital fissure.
Superior orbital fissure and inferior orbital fissure. So you know what a fissure is, like a crevasse. Foramens. Name a foramen. Vertebral foramen. Foramen magnum. Foramen ovale. We've had lots of foramens. Fossas. What's a fossa? Like a bowl or a ditch depression. So name some fossas. Orbital fossa. What do we have one right here? Temporal fossa. A cranial fossa. Right. So we have 3 of those. Can anyone name those?
Anterior, middle, and posterior.
Very good. Yeah. So we have 3 fossas. So that's just a ditch or a bowl. Sulcus. Now we haven't had sulcus, but a sulcus is another word for kind of a depression, but maybe kind of a more linear type of depression. Meatus. We've had meatus. What's meatus?
External auditory meatus.
External auditory meatus. Yeah, so like a meandering type of canal. So these, you could find these kind of depressions on almost any bone. I mean, not all bones are going to have all of them, but these are just general terms to describe textures or landmarks or surfaces. So we have, now not everything is up here, let me give you some others. So, but let's talk about this, processes that form points of connections. So we've had the spinous process and the transverse process, so you guys all know that one. Line, I don't know if you've had a line, oh yeah, no we did, the temporal lines. Do you remember the temporal lines? And the nuchal lines that you find in the back of the head. So these are just the lines in the bone. Just to make sure you're getting this, what forms the lines? How do the lines get formed? What? Well, why is there a line here on the temporal, on the parietal? Why do we have this temporal line on the parietal bone? It's a muscle attachment. So when the muscles attach to the bones, they are, think of this, the muscle, every muscle has a tendon, even if it's 1 cell thick. So it's got a tendon, it's going into the periosteum, which is going into the bone, so the tendon's pulling on that. What is the bone gonna do? It's gonna grow, right? It's gonna get heavier or thicker where it's being pulled on all the time, because bones are gonna respond to pressure. You know, the best thing you can do for your bones is weightlifting. Any type of activity that is weight bearing is good for your bones. So just remember that, you know, it's very, very important to have weight bearing exercises. You need the others for your heart, but that's for your bones. So a line is formed by the muscle attaching at that spot. Epicondyles, the first one we had was this week. Anyone want to hazard what is this one right here? It's the medial epicondyle. It's part of the humerus. So an epicondyle is, you guys all grab yours because you can palpate this. On the inside of your elbow, do you feel this little knob? That's an epicondyle, meaning epi, above the condyle. So you have the condyle that's allowing you to have the hinge, and above it is this little bony, it's not quite like a process, although it might look like one, but it's called the condyle, epicondyle. And then a crest, we'll have some crests next week. I don't know if we have any crests this week in the lab, I can't remember. But we have the iliac crest. So a crest would be like this edge of bone. Processes that form joints, condyles, we've already had that, facets, the head, like today we're going to talk about the humeral head, you'll see the humeral head in the lab. Then there's a few other things that weren't on here. This is actually from your book. It's just, well, you can kind of read this. So these are some of these other depressions. Now we have, this is one that gets everybody, a tubercle and tuberosity. So a tubercle is, basically they're almost the same. The tubercle would be a little more projection, the tuberosity would be a little more diverse. But these, and this is in your book, you don't need to copy this down, this is a chart in your book of bone markings. The tuberosity, like we have the deltoid tuberosity, and it's just this roughened kind of area. We had the sacral tuberosity, this kind of roughened area by the sacroiliac joint. Let's see, trochanter, we only have one, and it's on our hips. So this one is, it's not like anything. It looks like a hammer. It is a hammer, kind of a hammer on our hip. And pretty much, if you are uncertain about what a bone marking is, then just please go and refer to this chart in your book. It's very, very good. So the osseous tissues support, form, posture, protection of our vital organs. That video we showed, and I showed in the beginning, you could see the bones. I just really love that because you could really see the bones kind of enveloping all the organs. And you can really see how the bones have form our whole entire body. And of course, when we talk about arthrology, we'll talk about and when we study muscles, this will be more important, but we'll study about the mechanics. So far we've been looking at bones and joints. When we get muscles in there, then all of a sudden you're really going to see this whole total picture of these body mechanics and the types of levers. So our bones are like a lever. Do you guys all know what a lever is? Like, you're familiar with a wheelbarrow? You know, you can pick up a lot of weight with a wheelbarrow because you have a lever. So a lever is, well, this, you know, a seesaw like this. This is a lever. This would be the lever. Or, you know, a lever, you can pick up something heavy with a long stick under it because you have this mechanical advantage. So this is how our body works. We have mechanical advantages and levers. It's a whole series. Our muscles and joints all become a series of pulleys and levers. And of course, bones, the red bone marrow is involved in hemopoiesis, which means forming red blood cells. And then, of course, we have a lot of calcium and fats, lipids that are stored in our bones. I can just tell you anecdotally, a lot of women, you know, as you get older, women have a risk for osteoporosis because of the lack of estrogen. It's a little more physiological. We'll talk a little bit about it, but women that try to, I want to tell this because I